So we were just trying to figure out a little bit of the context of history, the coup in 2009. You want to talk a little bit about that and how we've come to the situation in the recent elections?
Sure. There's a long history, a long sordid history of U.S. intervention in Central America generally, and Honduras specifically. Military intervention, commercial intervention, the lack of respect for sovereignty and for the rights of people in Central America. The recent case you're talking about, in 2009, there was a coup. The military came into the presidential residence, seized the incumbent president, sitting president Manuel Zelaya. While he was in his pajamas sleeping, they stuck him on a plane that passed through an airbase where there's a large U.S. presence, a large U.S. military presence. Difficult to believe that could happen without the acquiescence, at least, of the U.S. military, and flew him out of the country. The successor regime, led ostensibly by civilians, a representative of the most powerful families, the oligarchy in Honduras, passed through a couple of presidents who weren't there very long and wound up under the leadership of Juan Orlando Hernandez, who became president after elections in 2013. I'm avoiding saying elected because there are doubts about the validity of that election, but was just supposedly re-elected in elections that took place November 26th of this year. Those elections are not considered credible according to reports by observers from the Organization of American States, likewise observers from the European Union. In fact, the head of the Organization of American States, a group not considered friendly to the opposition in Honduras, suggested a new election was necessary. So we have a president who's now entering on a second term, which is forbidden by the Honduran Constitution, after an election that is not considered credible. People have turned out into the streets to resist that. They already went to the polls, that didn't work, so now they're in the streets and have been protesting continuously since the election took a turn for the worse in the process of announcing results. It's worth mentioning the initial results that were announced officially, with over half the returns in, showed the opposition candidate leading by more than 5%. At that point, the announcement of returns was interrupted for over 24 hours. When the process resumed, the incumbent president steadily overtook the opposition candidate, eventually was named the winner, which no one actually accepts as legitimate.
Mm-hmm. So also now there's been a lot of resistance to the elections and people in the streets not accepting that. What is the call from groups to people in the U.S.? What kind of actions can they take?
The incumbent government, and I should make clear that this is not just about one election or one case of election fraud, it's about a dictatorship that's increasingly powerful. That dictatorship depends upon the support of the United States government to continue in power. Support in the terms of funds for the military and police, for the state security forces, support rhetorically. What the U.S., if we had an ambassador, which we don't right now, the charge d'affaires, so the most senior U.S. diplomat in Honduras says, what that person says has a great deal of influence. That affects the perception of many actors in the Honduran context. So support from the U.S. government, rhetorically, financially, materially, is crucial for the power of the regime. And what people ask us to do is to end that support, to do what we can to diminish the support of the U.S. government for repression and dictatorship in Honduras.
Wasn't Negroponte the ambassador down there during the Central American conflicts?
Part of the dirty history is that Honduras was used as a base of operations by the U.S. during the shooting wars in Central America in the 70s. So there were actual wars in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala between insurgencies and governments. Honduras did not have that, but it did have a large presence. It was used as a training ground for the U.S.-backed Contra, who attacked Nicaragua in that stretch of time. And it was also the bastion of U.S. power in Central America, which it continues to be. There's a large air base known by different names, either Palmarola or Sotocano, which continues to be the foothold of the U.S. in Central America.
So, I mean, it's just the history of violence in the area and U.S. support for basically controlling and playing, sort of pulling the strings of dictators that are favorable to the U.S. interests and corporations in that area. If we go back to the 2009 coup, we also had Hillary Clinton, who was very supportive of that dictatorship, or actually in the works of making it recognized, accepting it as a recognition, as U.S. Troops actually take out in his pajamas and ship him to, what was it, the Republic of the Congo or something?
Costa Rica is where they set up.
Oh,
It was Honduran troops who actually did that, but they had to pass through an airbase with a large U.S. presence. Effectively controlled by the U.S., so it's unlikely that could happen without people being aware and acquiescing at a minimum. What the U.S. government certainly did not do is what other governments did: denounce the coup as a coup, refuse to recognize or cooperate with the illegitimate government that succeeded after the coup, and do everything they could to return to the rule of law in Honduras.
So then when you look back at that history, when you're looking at the violence that is taking place in Honduras over the period before the elections, we're talking about corruption, about the cartels that have come into these countries, drug cartels. A lot of young kids, young people were fleeing the country to get away from gang violence and even police abuse, and took these long train rides through Mexico and get into the U.S. and, well, again, Hillary Clinton says, let's just send them back. We got to teach these parents not to send their kids off on this dangerous ride. Instead, she's willing to send them back to be executed if it's possible, or be forced into these gangs. Who knows what else? A lot of kids were abused on these train rides. Some died, some were killed, some were raped, all kinds of situations that happen. And they come to our border seeking help, and then we turn our backs on them. Part of the problem of this whole idea of deportations of people from other countries, especially those fleeing from violence and economic violence based on drugs and corruption and everything else, coming to this country and then saying, you know, it's their fault, we've got to do something. We're responsible oftentimes, or our government, or I hate to say we, because we as activists are not responsible, we're trying to stop this stuff, but that a lot of our leadership is responsible for the corruption that exists, that they're sending people across the border seeking help, putting their faith in the beliefs that this country does have compassion and care for them. And it's sad to see that we're still playing with this idea of sending them back.
The U.S. government certainly does contribute substantially to the conditions in Honduras that drive people out. If the U.S. did not have the free trade policies that it does, if the U.S. did not support the security forces in Honduras the way it does, if the U.S. did not turn a blind eye to narco-trafficking by people in power in Honduras the way it does, there would be less need for people to leave Honduras in order to survive economically. A great deal of the population in Honduras itself depends on money sent back by their family members and friends in the U.S. So the survival of the Honduran population as a whole is connected to the ability to make a living in the global economy, largely dominated by U.S.-based corporations, U.S.-based actors. That's one very important consideration in the current discussion about temporary protected status. The Honduran economy depends to a large extent on people who do work in the U.S. and send money back. If those people are not able to do that, it'll be a huge damaging blow to the Honduran economy, to families in particular, and there's no way that the number of people presently in the U.S. could be absorbed with the very poor employment opportunities that exist in Honduras.
So you went to Honduras. You went with what, Witness for Peace or SOA, or you're part of both of those?
Through Witness for Peace, I went to accompany Honduran organizations that asked for accompaniment because of the threats to them in this current context of post-election violence by the state.
And let's talk a little bit about that violence. I had heard, and we discussed it earlier, that you were being chased by the security forces, whichever one it might be, and that I had heard that somebody had been killed. You said no, that not directly in front of you, but you do have other people that had been. And so could you just kind of take us through that scenario that you were telling me earlier?
Mm-hmm. The general context is that since the election fraud, people have protested in the streets. The way they've done that typically is set up barricades. They'll block a road with burning tires, with fallen trees. They may park a tractor trailer crosswise across the road. They'll set up a barricade as a means of protest. and people have been present at those barricades to defend them, the police will arrive and evict the people from the barricade using tear gas. Initially, they shifted from using tear gas to using also live ammunition to drive people away from barricades. People would be retreating to neighborhoods, chased by police, in some cases killed. There have been dozens of people killed by state security forces since the elections. So in the course of late November, December, and January, different sources give you different numbers, but it's somewhere in the 30s or 40s by now, people killed by state security forces. And while I was there, the group that I accompanied, which is called the Movimiento Amplio por la Dignidad y la Justicia, so the wide movement for dignity and justice, which is in the north of Honduras, was facing severe threats to its leadership. I stayed near their leader almost all the time I was there in January, but also attacks on their grassroots membership. In January, while I was present in Honduras, 2 of their grassroots members were killed in towns where we had been, where we went after they were killed as well. We were not present at the time. We did talk to people who were witnesses afterwards and attended the wake and funeral of one of these people who were killed. In one case, it was an extrajudicial execution. Police in uniform came in the wee hours of the morning to the house where this man they'd identified as an activist lived. They beat him, they took him out in front of his family, out to the main highway where they executed him. They shot him dead. It was something like 40 shots that were fired to kill him by police in uniform. No attempt to conceal who was responsible or what they did. They then dumped his body in a location that also sent a message as far as their purpose in killing this person.
Let me just interrupt a little bit here. I mean, as a veteran, these stories really affect me deeply, and people don't realize, you know, in these situations, this is war with people, and their families and children that don't have a parent that comes home, or a father or brother or sister. The pain of this is tremendous, and I hope people realize this. We're not just telling a story for a statistic. These people have names, they have families, and this is life and death, and you know, take it deeply and really pay attention to what John is saying here, because I think it's important to, I mean, I've got a tear in my eye right now, because it just is, it's difficult for me to hear about somebody else killing another human being, being a veteran who was a part of the Vietnam War.
This man's name was Giovanni, to put a name to the case.
Thank you.
And we heard the story from his family. So it is a very difficult situation. It's something incredibly hard for them to handle, and they're also still under threat, because obviously this was a targeted killing that is a menace to the family that survives as well. The people in Honduras repeatedly, different people in different places, did describe the situation currently as being a war zone. Their words, not mine. It's a war zone right now. In our specific case, so you asked about that also, we were out front of a house at night watching what was going on in the street. There was a barricade fairly close by on one hand. There was a presence of the militarized police farther away on the other side in front of the house, down the main highway. The barricade was one of a series set up during the course of the night that had been gradually evicted in the process I described, using tear gas attacks by the police. We were outside waiting to see what happens. All at once there were a series of explosions. Everybody in front of the house took off running inside. There was an electric gate to the driveway of the house that was open. People ran inside, I with them, fast as we could. One person trying to run to get inside the house was not quite going to catch up with us. I waited to see if he got in, which he did. Continued into the house with everybody else, around the corner, to the door to the kitchen. And I couldn't get there fast enough to get in. There were a lot of people trying to get in the door at once. We're already inside the premises, but not inside the building in my case. I kept going to the back of the patio, turned around and looked, and saw a member of the security force